Okay, thanks for having me, Loris. And I am the last in-person talk, which means two things. I couldn't enjoy anything. For the rest of the time, I was just like, oh, I'm going to give my talk, But let's give a big round for Loris for organizing the whole thing. You know, it's just really I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about this. It's something I've thought a lot about and have lots and strong opinions, some of which I will reveal, not all of them. And you know, I sort of shot the application like, here, how about this subject? And then I realized after the fact how polarizing that title is. It's like ready for Hacker News to just start clicking on it, you know. But I promise it'll be kind of a nuanced take, and I hope that it'll give you something to think about. So, some relevant information about me. My name is Jeff. I'm from the US originally, as you probably can tell, but I live in Copenhagen now with my family. I'm a senior engineer at Pecan, which was a startup in Denmark. It was acquired by Workday a couple years ago, so now I work for Workday. I try to write about Zig projects I've done. Some of them are kind of hobby and learning projects, things like that, but on blog.jfo.click, you might have seen Hello, Hello World, which is something I'm really proud of from a couple years ago. It's kind of a deep, deep dive in just a Hello World program, all the way down to the assembly. Or Making Waves with Zig, which is not as intense, but I did this summer, and thanks to Felix for the response on that. Now this is particularly relevant and pertinent to this talk. Before moving into technology, I was a full-time musician in New York for some amount of years. I hesitate to say many, but enough. So I did an LS until late adulthood. I mean, you know, until relatively recently in terms of my life. And so, as you might expect, that perspective will figure prominently in this talk, and I think it's part of what informs my opinions here. Shout out to the conference sponsor, Recurse Center, who facilitated that career change. And I just did another batch this summer with Mindy. Actually, we did my first batch together, and was that your first batch too? Yeah. Yeah, so we did our first batches together and then another one this summer. I highly recommend it. Happy to talk about it. Life-changing experience for me, and it continues to be, as I say, a font of inspiration and community. Also, this slide I really didn't want to do. I don't like talking about myself that much, but my wife was like, you have to tell them this stuff. Or nothing else makes sense, so I have to listen to her, I guess. So the structure of this talk is the introduction, that's this part. I want to define our terms, technology and art. Of course, we kind of need to do that. We like to know what things mean. I have 3 vignettes or short thoughts or stories about some different things that kind of relate to this. And then I want to have some conclusions question mark, and then I want to have one more thing, like Columbo style, and then I want to do conclusions, period. So I hope that kind of lays it out. All right, so the first thing I want to start with is a surprise. You may be surprised to learn that this is not a talk about AI or ML at all. In fact, all of my thinking on this subject has been informed prior to this kind of boom that's coming out recently, right? And of course, that's very relevant to what I'm talking about. Obviously, I'm sure most of you assumed it was going to be about that. And it certainly does relate. So I invite you to kind of consider the things I'm talking about in relation to the AI and ML stuff that's happening now. But what I'm trying to do with this talk is sort of more broad perspective of like the way technology and art are either in opposition or in dialogue or both. Spoiler alert, maybe. It's not about Napster. It could be about Napster. As a musician, I have strong opinions about Napster. As a technologist, I have strong opinions about Napster, as most of us probably do. I have to make an I'm old joke here, because when I ran this at work for some coworkers to like practice, I was like, does anyone not know what Napster is? And some people didn't know what Napster is. So I'm not going to make you raise your hand, but I'm sure there's someone that doesn't know what Napster is, which was the first kind of file sharing thing that almost single-handedly destroyed the music industry. And you know, the Metallica hot takes aside, the reality is if you look at income or the amount of money in the industry, in the music industry, it just craters, you know, and that has a real effect on what's available to musicians and, you know, how they can make a living in sort of a middle class way. That could be a whole other talk. I just gave part of it just then, but And it's not about NFTs either, not about NFTs, not at all. So what is it about? This is going to be a personal perspective, and I don't intend to presume to definitively answer the titular question. I also don't intend to read every slide, sorry about that, but that particular phrasing I think is important. It is kind of a hot question, and I don't want to stand up here and say I know for sure what the answer to it is, but I will give you my perspective. And so I consider this talk successful if you kind of have a new way to frame the issues and ways to think about it. So that's kind of my goal here. So let's start with defining our terms. Oh, it animates? Is that just latency? Whatever. So art. So Webster's dictionary, no, I'm just kidding. So this is a very broad definition, and it's a very personal definition. But in my opinion, art is any activity in which perfection can be pursued. So as an artist or a creator of something, and it could be almost anything. I mean, this is sort of intentionally vague. And you'll also note that it includes programming, technology, and things like that. That's also on purpose. I want to give some examples of how I think about this, right? This quote, "Art is never finished, only abandoned," Da Vinci. The other one I've heard in many, I don't know who to attribute it to, I've heard it in many forms in many ways, but great poems, great songs, great plays aren't written, they're rewritten. That also kind of focuses on the process of the creation and not on the thing that you are creating, which is, I also need to point out, there's not always a thing that you're creating as an artist. You could be performing a dance or a musical thing that's not recorded, and you are creating that performance, but that is ephemeral. So there's not a thing that you've produced in that instance, right? So where is the art there? Well, the art is in the process. It's in the creation process of the thing, even if it is gone with the wind, right? Technology is something we're all probably a lot more familiar with, just based on the crowd. I don't know. But I define that as tools, apparatus, approach, and technique. And I've got a couple of examples here I hope will kind of clear up, especially the last one, the last two, actually, because I think those are not usually thought of as kind of under the umbrella of technology. So consider the pianoforte. So a piano is that as a piano, two of them. And when it was originally created, it was called the pianoforte. Why? Because it could play piano soft and forte loud, both things. And you think like, ooh, wow, that's wild, but it was revolutionary at the time. The thing that it added here was this hammer. You could hit it loud or hit it hard to play loud, hit it soft to play quiet, right? And that seems like kind of that music can be soft or loud, but this was a big deal. It replaced the harpsichord, which looked, similar, although aesthetically different in terms of how it's decorated. But the mechanism for how harpsichord is played is actually a pluck. It's tough to see here. I know it all kind of blends together, but you can see that little hook coming out of the wood there. Now you can have dynamics on a harpsichord. You can play loud and soft. You can play louder and softer. But really, effectively, your choice is between a tone and something that sounds kind of like overplayed, right? So this opened up whole new worlds of expression for musicians on the pianoforte to be able to play with this vastly wider dynamic range. Now that is a technology, right? So again, a broad definition of both art and technology, but maybe the other one is single point perspective. Now this is actually something I don't really know that much about, but it does go directly to the point, pun intended, I guess. Single point, terrible. So art, before single point perspective, which is basically the idea that you have a point in the frame that you are focusing all the lines towards. Before that, things were kind of busted, right? Like, look at this bed. Who built that bed? Like, if you look at one part of it, you're like, oh, that looks like a bed. But then you kind of take the whole thing in and you're like, what? Who? And I mean, this is also, a technology. And nothing has changed about what you're using to create the art. The only thing that's changed is the thought process, the approach, right? But that very much falls under the same umbrella because it unlocks and facilitates new approaches and new ways to do things. Now, the art critic in me is like, well, one's not necessarily better than the other, but having that technology available widens the palette of the artist. So I think that's important. Okay, so 3 vignettes, as I said. So the Nikon D1 was the world's first viable prosumer digital SLR camera. So it's kind of a silly word, but it operates in that space where enough consumers want to buy it to make it worth making a lot of them and kind of cost effective that way, and enough pros want to buy it because it has like some kind of professional application. It was released in 1999. It retailed for $5,500 US dollars, which is almost 10,000 now. And it was 2.7 megapixels, which is so few megapixels. And just for comparison, like the iPhone 14 that's coming out this year is 48 megapixels. Now, if you know anything about photography, megapixels aren't really the whole thing. Like, who cares? Like, it's not the real measure of the quality, but it's a good proxy for the level of the technology we're talking about here. And 2.7 megapixels is barely enough to print, a little picture 4 by 6 inches. Sorry, it's my American coming out. But it revolutionized everything anyway. So the real world professional use case here was news photography. So you don't need that many megapixels to print something in a newspaper, especially if it's black and white, right? And having the expediency of sending along on an email or on the wire or however is so much more valuable to that professional class. And that was kind of the hook that brought it in. Now the reason I'm talking about this artifact in history here is, there was a whole class of professional photographers, artists, creatives that worked in the medium that took one look at this thing and they compared it to what they had and what they were used to, which was film, which was, of course, itself also a technology, but one that had over 100 years to develop. Sorry about that. Yeah, it's another. Yeah. Over 100 years to develop, and it was very advanced technology, in comparison. And they said, that's never going to replace this. This is garbage. It looks awful. It's expensive. Like, who's going to want to use that? And of course, it doesn't take, a art historian to say, like, wow, were they wrong? I mean, it's real hard to find a dark room these days, and I've tried to do that. But there's this whole class of people who kind of had the rug pulled out from under them. And the reasoning was that they weren't able to kind of, you can sort of see the writing on the wall. Kind of in retrospect, it's easy to sort of say that, but like lots of new technologies come and go, and if you poo-poo most of them, you're mostly going to be right? Most of them kind of go by the wayside. It's only in retrospect that we see this technology, so wow, that took over the world, right? It's in every phone. Everybody has even just a snapshot camera, or maybe like a lot of people have DSLRs like this, so they're very high quality, right? And of course, the quality itself at this point is super high, right? Like you can create images that are at the same level as film. The textural, we can have a conversation about like the differences in the media, right? But that's a different conversation in terms of the application of the technology. It's hard to be a full-time film photographer these days. The next thing I want to talk about is chess and deep blue. And this is a little bit different, right? Photography is sort of obviously an art, right? It's like you create a thing and you make some representation of something and you kind of have a voice through it. Chess may be a little bit different. If you play chess, who plays chess? Anybody? It's a few people, right? If you don't play it, you might not think about it as a creative thing, but it's sort of the same as programming from the outside in. And like I said, I came into programming late, and I was very surprised at how creative a thing it is, and how it's not just doing, math problems all the time. Of course, math can be creative on its own too. But, just in terms of the decisions you can make, the aesthetics of code, there's a whole other conversation to be had about that. And that was surprising to me, coming from the outside in. And chess can be the same way. It's a very creative thing, how the pieces work together and there's kind of flow and all this stuff. And certainly the advanced players and grandmasters and people think about it that way. They think about it as a creative endeavor. They think about it as an art. And if we go back to my personal definition here, something that in which perfection can be pursued. Well, certainly chess fits that, right? So if you're not familiar with Deep Blue, Garry Kasparov was the world champion in the 90s and was considered at the time to be the best chess player ever in all of history. He played against IBM's Deep Blue computer, which was specifically made to play chess and to do this kind of like exhibition match. He won the first match just barely in 1996, but in 1997 he played again and he lost. He lost decisively, and this seems kind of, again, similar to the camera, right? It seems kind of obvious now. You look back on it, it's like, could you design a better tree traversal problem than chess? Like, you just need more and more hardware, more and more kind of pruning algorithms and kind of cleverness around it to make it effective. But, you know, I think at the time people were just flabbergasted, like, how could this be possible? Chess is this creative human endeavor, and yet how could a computer do it, you know? This seems laughable to us now. But it was world-rocking to the chess world at the time. And I have a little video we could play, but I don't think it's worth moving it over, so I'll just, maybe at the end. And ever since then, computers have been categorically better, right? Like, not to bring the iPhone in again, but you can get a chess engine on your iPhone that will beat Magnus Carlsen every time, which is ridiculous. I mean, so why play chess, right? Like, I mean, if a computer can get closer to perfection, you know, then why do it? Rhetorical question. I'll come back to that. Let's watch the video real quick. I'll skip it. Maybe I'll do it at the end. So, talking about Magnus Carlsen, is current world champion is a little problematic, but I guess he's a world champion, and at this point, widely considered to be the best ever. So, having surpassed Kasparov, or at least become his equal in historical context. You know, he's grown up his whole career. He's about a lot younger, right? His whole career has been post Deep Blue. So there's never been a time when he's played chess where it's all like, people can be computers, right? And I want to have this quote. I'm going to attribute it to him. I looked everywhere for it. I could not find the actual quote. I've heard him express a similar sentiment a lot of times, so I'm going to have to paraphrase it, but I'm really sure that he said it, and he said it about 10 years ago, something around like, we are free to just play chess now. And it really stuck with me. Again, I can't find a direct attribution. I'm really sorry about it. I looked everywhere. I probably spent more time looking for that quote than any other part of this talk. But it's just so important to how I've been thinking about this, because it's not a question anymore, right? The computer will win every time. Okay, well, what is just play chess? What is that art? Well, it's the playing, right? It's the process of doing it. And that's what's valuable to him, clearly. And winning. He loves to win. That's famously true. But so that's another thing. The third thing is a lot more personal of a story. It's a place called Zimp Studios. None of you have heard of this. It's been out of business for years. I went to undergrad in North Carolina. Again, I studied music. And after I graduated, a really good friend of mine, great jazz piano player, got a job at this place in Raleigh, North Carolina called Zimp Studios. And they were doing this really interesting thing. They were doing re-performances of great solo piano works. So what that means is they would go in, and the two that I remember are Glenn Gould's Goldberg Variations and Art Tatum, I think, some solo piano. They would go into these old, scratchy, mono, terrible recordings, and they would transcribe them with such great detail and care, something like 12 to 16 parameters per note. And then they would play them back through a modern digital player piano. And when I say that, I mean it's digitally controlled, but it's an actual physical piano. And re-record them with modern techniques, or modern at the time, of course, but they sounded a lot better. And in fact, I want to take the time to play this for you because it's worth hearing the difference. This is the original recording. Let's play a few seconds of it. Stop on the phrase there. And here's the re-recording. So it's a little tough with these speakers, but I think you can hear a difference. I think you can hear the difference definitely in the stereo aspect of it. But what's interesting about that, amongst other things, is that, is that Glenn Gould playing, right? It's definitely mediated through a layer of this transcription process. But similar to the chess thing, where people are like, oh no, chess is over, it's not a human creative thing anymore. Like, what are we going to do? There was some kind of hand-wringing about that at the time with this too. And I'll read this directly from the New York Times review of this. The disappointment is also a relief. The disappointment referring to it's not the same or something. For had Zimt succeeded, there would have been severe price. Had that really been Gould's sound coming from the piano, it would have dealt a severe blow indeed to an ancient prejudice, that music in all its complexity is beyond the reach of the merely technical, and that it belongs in creation and interpretation to humanity's ever-shrinking domain. Relief, no Gouldian robotics yet. Now, I remember reading this at the time and just being like, what are you talking about? Like, it's not taking anything away from that original performance. In fact, like, it's adding to it, if anything, right? If you hear that, they're function. I'm a trained listener, and they sound pretty similar. Maybe you have a different perspective. But this way of thinking about it, where technology and art are in direct opposition to each other, happens over and over again, right? We see that with photography. Oh no, never take over. See that with chess. Well, it's a human endeavor. Same with music, right? And I don't really understand that, because the point of the art process is the creative process itself for the person. So that's the conclusions question mark. Let me get to the second thing here. So this is a real picture. A lot of these pictures I've shown, by the way, I should note, were Dolly generations. Some of them I remembered to put down the prompt underneath them, but that's some of the AI content of this. No NFT content, but there's some AI content. This is a real picture of the sand mandala. So this is a Buddhist art form that is very intricate, maybe creating with sand, colored sand. But the pertinent thing to this talk about this is that when it's done creating and people have looked at it, it's swept away to signify the insignificance of it, right? So again, you're not producing a thing. The product isn't the point. The point is the process of doing it. So I think I've gotten to the conclusions period. So the technology is coming, the technology is here. So we can talk about AI a little bit right now. I know a lot of this has been kind of implied and sort of been circumspect around making any kind of like proclamations about how this relates to that. But I hope you see what I'm trying to get at, which is that over and over again, you see this pattern where technology kind of encroaches on something that is thought to be human, like very definitionally human. And then, sort of initial iterations are kind of thought to be inadequate. Okay, fine, we're safe. They're not taking the poets' jobs. And then they do, kind of over and over again. And that's why this is kind of a big takeaway that I feel really strongly about. Judging a burgeoning tech by its initial iterations is a folly. It's photography and chess. And we are not exempt. GitHub Copilot, I'm sure everyone has tried that and been like, oh, phew. It's terrible, but it's not going to be terrible for long. Now, I will admit that we are very likely a special case as people in the industry able to kind of like ride the wave up the level of abstraction. So that's worth another whole talk on its own. But what I want to point out here is just the fact that that pattern will repeat for us too. So what I've also tried to get at a little bit here is creativity and art is what I mean. Is a personal human process that is independent of the resulting product. Technology will never displace that process for individuals, right? Like, art is available to you as a human, even if a computer can always do it better, as in the case of chess. People are still playing chess. It's a very frustrating game. You can tell I play it a little bit. So does technology destroy art? Well, I would say no. And Mindy, what was that thing you told me?
I don't know.
The
Betteridge's Law.
Betteridge's Law. Yeah, I learned about this. Any talk or headline with a question mark at the end can always be answered with no. So I should have known that before I submitted it. I don't think it does. I think it's in dialogue with art, and I think it's worth saying that technology is itself art. There's a dramatic overlap between the two disciplines. And I think that that's reinforced by some of the other talks today, which I really enjoyed, by the way. But, and there's a but, it can irrevocably disrupt markets and communities that make the development of skills possible. And this is what I would like to be the real takeaway. Because everything else I've said is sort of kind of like, oh, that's neat, maybe some stuff you didn't know, a different perspective. But I want to end with this story about Bartleby the Scrivener. So Bartleby the Scrivener is a story by Melville, guy who wrote Moby Dick. And what the fuck is a scrivener? A scrivener is a copyist. They had loads of them in law offices in the late 1800s, and they would just copy things, copy documents, make draft things, right? They definitely do not exist anymore. Have you ever met a scrivener? No, you've met plenty of people who maybe do calligraphy. That's different. But I bet they had amazing handwriting. And why did they have amazing handwriting? Because they worked in a job that promoted that skill. And that skill was fertile, and that job, that community, maybe the Scrivener pub where they all got drunk after work, was fertile ground for, that skill, that art of handwriting. I'm sure there were some beautiful things written by them. I have to note that I'm doing a disservice to this story. It's worth reading. It has kind of some good stuff about it. But if you know the story, Bartleby is famous for saying, I would prefer not to. So he just kind of opted out of modernity at the time and didn't want to do his job. And now he doesn't have to anymore because there are no scriveners. And I'm doing a disservice to let's read that. But yeah, that's what I have. I've got this slide about blah, blah, blah. But that's my talk.
Thank you very much, Dan. That was a great talk. So, do we have any questions? Okay, I see a few hands.
Let's go. Not a question, but like a comment on your slide, on your previous slide. Last year in the train, I met a guy that was pretty old. I think he was at least 80, and he was talking about image manipulation without like Photoshop. And I was talking quite long about exactly that topic, like his job is now obsolete. And he was also like, yeah, it's sad that this art is gone, but I'm also super lucky that nobody has to learn this anymore because it's super complex and complicated to like actually work on a physical analog film and remove stuff from it, replace it, and like create the same level of fidelity like with Photoshop, which is a lot easier. And
Yeah.
I think this fits pretty well into your talk and also into the conclusion of the last slide that sometimes it's good that technology replaces like the manual process, but like the act of creating is still the same. I have an idea, I will replace, or like I will create something. The tool has just changed.
Yeah, that's a really good example. And I mean, in that guy's case, he was like, oh, phew, nobody has to do this terrible job anymore. But in many instances, that can be a great sadness that there's this lost art, right, of splicing film. And I think that we have to be empathetic about that as technologists who are often the ones kind of displacing things like that.
Next question?
I'm going to struggle to piece this together. There was so much stuff in this talk that I wanted to pick your brain about. And it's obviously like a open-ended topic, but I think the most relevant one is seeing how you define or you frame art as more about process, and creative process, and striving for perfection rather than a product. I think that obviously there are many, many ways you could define art or say what's the primary point of art or what it is, but I feel like there must be many instances of something where the product is the art itself. And one thing that comes to mind is, I guess I've heard sometimes defined as something that makes you see the world a different way. And that is focused on the product rather than how the person made it. A little example, I told this story last night, so it may plug your ears, but essentially a friend was telling me about an art exhibit he went to where there's like a room, it's a full art installation. You go in, there's like a clock on the wall, there's a hanging mirror, there's a bed, there's a plant, and you kind of, see what this person's life is like in this room. And then he walked out of the room and looked in the mirror, and then he noticed he didn't see his own reflection. And he wondered why, and he put his hand into it, and it was not a mirror, it was a full mirrored copy of the room on the other side of the wall. And it was just, and that was kind of the little gotcha moment you're supposed to find. It's almost an Easter egg that probably many people miss. But anyway, that's not, I don't think about the process that the person went through to make that necessarily, or I don't think that process is what I think of as the art, but the experience that they created for me. And I don't know if you have any thoughts about how technology interacts with that. That was kind of a long lead up in a big.
No, I totally get it. I mean, I have tons of thoughts. That's really relevant. And I left a lot out here, and kind of apologize for that. Like, I really was stressing over this talk. How am I going to get all of my thoughts packed into this? The first thing I'll say is that when the product is the point, or say you're building a chair, there's a lot of art involved with building a chair. I think that's traditionally been thought of as the difference between art and craft, right? Where there's a lot of overlap there, but you're crafting a thing. There's a crafted end product. Now to the second thing, that the function of art, which we didn't really talk about, right? Like that's sort of what you're getting at, right? If the function is only for the individual, which it very clearly is not, you're missing a lot. But in terms of how art allows people to communicate with each other, to give each other new experiences, that's a whole nother thing. And I think that's what you're saying is absolutely right. But I think I could write a whole nother talk about, like, does technology destroy that aspect? And that would be a different talk, to be honest. I think with the general question, I'm answering in the negative here with that definition, but I think you're absolutely right that it's not that simple. Does that?
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
I think there's one specific community who has a very strange relationship, which I was reminded of by your part with the chess players, and that is musicians. Because, of course, music is way older than music recordings. So the musical performance was first, definitely. Then we wanted to, catch this performance and put it on a record and show it to people. So that's like, we try our best to have this piece of art, which is the performance, on some recording, with, for example, a CD nowadays, or, well, not anymore. And now musicians themselves are in this very weird position, and I think the community is very splintered into different sub-communities. Some musicians try now to reproduce when they perform the recordings as well as possible, which are a try to reproduce the original performance as well as possible. While other musicians, I think, are more like the Norwegian chess player, and just say, well, now we can't just make music live. Still,
Yeah.
we can still just perform. The recording is like a separate piece from that.
Yeah.
And I think this is I don't know if there are other examples which are as tangled up as musicians, probably, but I think this is a very funny example of this whole back and forth.
Yeah, and now that you say that, actually, I mean, my focus on the personal process here and the ephemeralness of it is definitely informed by my perspective as a musician and not a painter, for example, someone who has a lot more of a tactile experience with the product. But I think what you say is not uniquely applicable to musicians, for sure. I mean, over and over again, technology comes and changes things, at the very least disrupts things, right? So people have to, in some cases, capitulate to it. In others, reorganize their relationship to it. But yeah.
Yeah, super interesting talk. Thanks for that. The last point that you drove home about kind of the economic factors that are kind of crushing there. I guess I'm curious. Do you have any thoughts around ways to prevent the loss of those skills over time and that sort of thing?
Yeah.
Aside from like, you know, somebody kind of afraid of Copilot, like, you know, listing, I forget what it was, prompt master or something on their resume or something. Prompt mancer.
Prompt mancer, right. Yeah, I mean, Jean-Luc Picard and his winery, kind of this post-scarcity world where people have the time and inclination to do what they want. I'm not really going to go any stronger than that, but yeah, that's it.
On kind of an unintentional tangent to that, one of your conclusions was that you think technology is kind of inevitable in causing that disruption. Do you think there's ways in which technology can be designed in order to be, I don't know if it's the right wording, but almost a good citizen in the way that it causes that disruption?
That's a great question. I mean, I think that's what we're all here for, really. Yeah. To think about ways that can be true for the narrow slice of art and creativity that we are focused on here, which is, for the most part, programming and hardware and technology. But that's also kind of a reflexive thing, right? It's very limited. But I think, like you say, it can be, I don't have the answer, but it can be applied to other places. But one thing that made me think of, and I kind of took this out of the talk because I didn't want to get too broad. It's already kind of sweeping, right? But we've all heard of the Luddites, and it's sort of used as a shorthand for anti-technology people, right? It's like, oh, the Luddite, they don't, want to send a letter with a stamp on it, you're a Luddite. But historically, the Luddites had kind of a good point. They were like, hey, the technology is coming to take our jobs, very literally, not in kind of like a fear-mongering way, but they were pushing against that inevitability. And I'm sorry I don't have more detail. I didn't actually do the research for this part, so I don't remember the details. But maybe I think the point that the change is inevitable is not necessarily inevitable, but we've all experienced this even in our lifetimes of just this march forward. But I really like your framing of it. Yeah, being good citizens. I don't have an answer really.
More questions? I see one. Yes.
This might be a little musician specific, but I was curious on your opinion about live music versus recorded music. Why does it matter? And then at what point do technology like backing tracks take away from live performance with your experience as a musician? So.
Well, I know that the buskers outside of my office really prefer backing tracks, which I think detracts from the experience. They're like the accordion player, But could you rephrase the question about the difference between live and recorded?
Yeah, I suppose recorded music is just pure technology, yet we still prefer live performance over recordings. And why is that? Why hasn't recordings killed live performance of music?
I would point directly to Stevie's question or comment before of, the recording is a truncation of the communication, right? If you're playing in a room with other people, you have a two-way street. And as a musician, playing for people is far more rewarding than recording it and sending it to them, although that can also be great. But that interpersonal communication as part of the performance is a huge part of it, right? Does that?
Yeah, no, that's good.
At risk of drifting slightly off topic, when you were a full-time musician, what were you doing?
Oh, I was a jazz guitarist.
Cool.
I did a lot of teaching and playing in rock bands and stuff. Good time, good thing to do when you're 26 in New York. It's a good thing to do now too, but I'm not sad I did it, and I still play, of course. But yeah, that's.
To the discussion about recorded music and live music, I would just point out that we have films, but we also have live theater. And that's it, that's my whole point.
another comment on process versus finished product. I think again for musicians, and I think there are quite a lot of musicians in the audience. For example, the whole chiptune scene, if you think about it, is much more about the process than the final product. Because you could do the same music you do on a Game Boy or on a Commodore 64 on a modern digital audio workstation, but the point of doing it with a Game Boy is you're doing it on a Game Boy. And actually the process itself, I find it, I do music on a Game Boy, so spoiler. So, and I find it relieving because like you have 4 tracks and it's a little bit the safety net that Steve was talking about. So you can't keep adding more tracks. You have 4 tracks to do your music and that's it. So you have to fit everything in. At one point, you can't add anything and you have to push this stuff out.
Yeah. Yeah, what was that phenomenology? To describing the
Constraints yield curiosity.
Well, there's that. Yeah, that's right too. But the phenomenology of the experience of making the thing and how that differs, where you could say you can make the same product kind of in both places, but making it on the Game Boy is a different process, is a different experience for the creator. Yeah.
Any other questions?
By the way, while he's walking over, I know you just said like we have a lot of overlap. A lot of musicians become programmers, and or vice versa. There's just a lot of overlap, and especially when I was first getting into it, I was often asked that. I was like, "Oh, do you think musicians make good programmers, and why?" And there's usually this implication that there's some sort of math adjacency, and that sort of explains it somehow. Like music is sort of mathy, and programming is sort of mathy. So And I was like, "No, that's not it at all. It's definitely the willingness to bang your head against the wall forever to get." I didn't know that was the applause line, but because as a musician, it just, for me anyway, personally, everybody's different, but it took years of work, really hard work, and I'm not even really there, to get to where I feel like I'm really expressing myself. And when I went into programming, people are like, "I'm not going to spend more than 5 minutes trying to make this thing," where it's like, stand back, because I got all day, Anyway, that's an extra hot take, I guess. Sorry, Felix.
Okay, so another first-hand experience on recorded music versus live music. I was actually, this year, I was on my first festival ever, and for me it's 20 years of only listening to recorded music and then going to a festival. And it's really a completely different experience to listen to live music for some bands actually, where the bands were just playing their regular songs, but they were also doing cheering up the masses and really having an interaction, as you said, this dialogue with. And there was this other band, pretty famous, it was Accept, a huge metal band, and I left the concert because they were just standing there playing their music, and it was basically, as it was pretty windy, it was basically more convenient to listen to the recording because it was the same experience in that part. So there is more value in listening to a live recording, and sometimes there's more value in listening to the actual recording for live music. And I found it pretty interesting for some other bands. It was truly a party, and they basically didn't even play their songs properly because nobody cared anyways. They were just here for the experience. And
was that a fish show, Felix?
For music. Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Any?
Okay. Just because Jeff brought it up,
Oh.
so the phenomenology thing. So what comes to mind for me is that how many people here get into a state of flow when you program? Raise your hands. Yeah. So that's the phenomenology of work. It's how it feels to work, right? And artists often do it to get into a state of flow. So something that I thought maybe you could comment on, Jeff, is I do programming, writing, and photography as forms of art/craft, and all 3 of them are intermediated by technology. That makes when the technology changes, it
makes the art making process feel different. So for example, as all of those cameras changed from film to SLRs and now like mirrorless cameras, for example, how it feels to make art, like photography, changes. For example, now with mirrorless cameras, you look through an electronic viewfinder that shows you the sensor output instead of showing you the light coming through the lens, which is how DSLRs worked, right? So just thoughts on that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there can be very profound differences with subtle changes too, even with not kind of earth-shaking technologies like we're talking about mostly, but I mean, just the quality of your instrument. To speak from my own experience, I think my first electric guitar was like a crummy Squier Stratocaster, and you couldn't have an A chord and an E chord and tune at the same time because it was just so poorly set up, you know. And when I hesitate to say graduated, but when I got a hold of professional instruments, it was a completely different experience, you know. And I don't think in that example, it's obviously I'm saying that it was a better experience, but in terms of the shifting phenomenology of experiencing different ways to make things, you're not always necessarily imposing a value judgment on that, right? It's not better or worse, but it is different, and we have to kind of appreciate that and respect that, and be aware that old styles, old techniques have a lot to offer. You know, they're not dead. One thing I kind of neglected to mention with the Scrivener example is, yeah, you can find calligraphers, right? People are still practicing that art. My only point with that was just that you really have to seek it out, and there's not a fertile ground, that's what I was trying to get at, right, anymore. And I'm sure there are many, many kind of completely inert outputs or creative avenues that are just lost to time, you know, basically, because we don't think about them, we don't need them. I tried to think of more. The Scrivener was kind of the only one I could really grab onto, but that's sort of the nature of it, right? They're gone. I don't know. We don't know about them. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So, okay, one last question, Simon. Just because it's you, I would not accept any other kind.
Would you say that art is created or discovered?
just an easy question, you said?
Like, I guess I'll just I'll do that presentation next time, maybe. No, I mean,
Is art created or discovered?
no, I heard him.
The answer you can just give is no.
That's a recursive question.
That's good. That's a recursive question. That's what. No, I mean, it depends, right? What do you want me to say? Yes, no. I think that given my emphasis here on the process, it kind of doesn't matter, right? Because the process of discovery is sort of the same as the process of creativity when viewed from the personal perspective. So there, is that a good answer? All right, thank you so much.